Alright, next we're going to be looking at the ear. So we're going to be focusing on organs for hearing and organs for balance. Now, when we're looking at the anatomy, there are three parts to the ear. The external ear, also known as the outer ear, the middle ear, sometimes called the tympanic cavity, because it's outlined by the tympanum or eardrum, and the internal or inner ear. Now, when it comes to the ear, we have the external ear and middle ear, which are involved with processing sound waves through air, and they're processing sound waves that are going to be involved in hearing. Now, with the internal ear, you not only have areas that process hearing information, but also areas that process equilibrium or balance information. And the receptors for hearing and balance are different and are located in different locations. Here we can take a closer look at the ear and its parts. So on the outside, you have the external ear, sometimes called the pinna because the auricle is most of the external ear, but it also includes the helix and the lobule. The external ear goes from the pinna to the tympanum, which is also known as the tympanic membrane or eardrum. Connecting the outer ear to the tympanum is the external acoustic meatus, also known as the auditory canal. Looking at the middle ear, we can see a cavity outlined by the tympanum towards the outer ear and the oval window towards the inner ear. It also contains three bones called the auditory ossicles, which are nicknamed the hammer, anvil, and stirrup from tympanum to oval window because of their shape. Also in this middle ear cavity is going to be the opening for the pharyngotympanic tube or auditory tube, which used to be known as the eustachian tube. The pharyngotympanic tube connects the middle ear cavity to the pharynx, which is your throat, and it equalizes pressure between those areas. Then we can also move to the internal ear, and we see multiple structures like the spiral kind of snail shell structure, that's the cochlea, which has receptors for hearing. And the other structures above it, the sac and the half circles, are the vestibule and the semicircular canals respectively, and they house the receptors for equilibrium. So let's look again at the external ear. It has the auricle, which is composed of the helix and the lobule, the external acoustic meatus or the auditory canal, which connects the outer ear to the tympanum. It also has things like hair, sebaceous glands, and ceruminous glands that produce earwax. And then we're going to end the external ear at the tympanum or eardrum, also known as the tympanic membrane, because that's the boundary between the external and middle ears. It's just a connective tissue membrane that vibrates in response to sound waves. So that's going to help us transfer sound wave energy from the external ear through the bones of the middle ear, and then the bones of the middle ear will get us to the internal ear. The middle ear is also air-filled, just like the external ear, but it is mucosa-lined. It's going to have laterally the eardrum and medially a bony wall that contains an oval and a round window. The oval window leads to the vestibular structures and the round window leads to the cochlear structures. And these are just thin areas of that medial wall. We also saw the pharyngotympanic or auditory tube, and that connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx, the upper part of the throat, to equalize pressure in that middle ear cavity with the external air pressure. Also, take a look at the middle ear again if you have a chance or have your book out, and look at those ear ossicles. Those are three small bones in the tympanic cavity, the malleus, incus, and stapes. The malleus is sometimes called the hammer, incus, the anvil, stapes, the stirrup because of shape. And they're suspended in place by ligaments, and they actually have between them synovial joints. They're able to increase the vibratory motion from the eardrum so that we increase the height of the sound waves that are moving into the internal ear. And that's because the external and middle ear are moving sound waves through air, but it's a lot harder to move sound waves through liquid. So we do want to not only transmit vibratory motion from the eardrum to the oval window, we want to increase the height of those sound waves. Also know that the tensor tympani and stapedius muscles are around this area, and they contract reflexively in response to loud sounds to help prevent damage to hearing receptors. Here's a closer look again at the auditory ossicles, which are the three bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes, from lateral to medial, that are located in the tympanic membrane or middle ear. We can also take here a closer look at the cochlea, vestibule, and semicircular canals. These are areas in the inner ear that are surrounded by the temporal bone. And we therefore have what's called a bony labyrinth and a membranous labyrinth. So think of removing all of the cochlea, the semicircular canals, and vestibule, and you'd be left with these bony canals or spaces where they used to be. That's the bony labyrinth. But if you put them back and then talk about what's inside them, you're looking at spaces inside membranes, the membrane of the cochlea, of the semicircular canals, and the vestibule. So that's the membranous labyrinth. It's both of them together that make up this space we call the inner ear. Now the cochlea is the bottom snail shell, and it essentially has three areas, and the center one would be the cochlear duct, where we have the spiral organ or organ of Corti that receives sound in the form of vibrations, and it's also going to have stereocilia on special cells that can be bent in order to turn those vibrations into nerve impulses. Then if we move to the top instead, we have semicircular canals, which are three half circles, an anterior, posterior, and lateral half circle, and these are going to be receptors for equilibrium. They have cristoreceptors, and they respond to angular movements of the head. Then you have the vestibule, which responds to changes in gravity and changes in the position of the head, and utilizes maculae receptors that sits between the semicircular canals and the cochlea, and is actually made up of two sacs within its one area, the superior utricle and bottom saccule. So when it comes to the vestibule, it's an egg-shaped central region, and it's in that bony labyrinth. It has two membranous sacs, the utricle and saccule, and these sacs house the equilibrium maculae receptors and again respond to gravity and changes in the position of the head. Whereas the three half circles or semicircular canals also process equilibrium information but have crista ampullae receptors which respond to angular movements of the head. But let's get to the cochlea, where the hearing receptors live. So when we're looking at the cochlea, we're looking at a spiral structure, but imagine it unwound. And it would just be one long duct with three general areas. So that's what we're seeing in this image, is the cochlea wound up and then a cross section showing that it creates multiple areas within this shape. But it's probably best to think about it unwound and be one long cochlear structure. In that cochlear structure, there's three little areas, and they're separated by membranes. The areas are the scala vestibuli, that's up top, a middle cochlear duct in the middle, and at the bottom a scala tympani. The top and bottom scala vestibuli and scala tympani respectively, those areas contain perilymph, which is a fluid different than what we find in the middle cochlear duct, sometimes called the scala media, and that's going to contain endolymph. Now if we take a closer look at the cochlear duct, we can note that it contains the spiral organ or organ of Corti, and that sits on top of a basilar membrane, and then on top of the organ of Corti or spiral organ is a tectorial membrane. And the cells of the spiral organ are connected to a neuron. So make sure to know all of that in this image before we go forward. Alright, here we're taking a closer look at the spiral organ, and we can see it sits on top of the basilar membrane with many supporting cells and a couple of hair cells. These hair cells have on them stereocilia, which are special hairs that when bent can generate a graded potential that then can go to the neuron and generate a secondary graded potential that may turn into an action potential. And that neuron is known as the cochlear nerve. It actually combines with the vestibular nerve to become the vestibular cochlear nerve, one of the 12 cranial nerves. But what we're seeing here is the spiral organ, the basilar membrane, the tectorial membrane, the hair cells in the spiral organ with supporting cells, and their stereocilia. So make sure you note all of that. Again, basilar membrane, spiral organ with its supporting cells and hair cells, the stereocilia on the hair cells, and the tectorial membrane. And again, all that sitting on the basilar membrane. Alright, what happens within the ear is when sound waves make it to the inner ear, they move through one of the upper or lower areas of the cochlea. That will push the basilar membrane upward, and that will push the hair cells into the tectorial membrane, causing those stereocilia to bend, creating a graded potential called a receptor potential that hopefully creates a graded potential in the dendritic endings of the cochlear nerve, which, if it does and it's strong enough, that graded potential of the cochlear nerve may turn into an action potential that gets to go towards the brain. So when we're talking about sound, we're talking about sound waves. We're talking about a pressure disturbance, alternating areas of high and low, producing a wave, generally vibrating an object. So it moves outward in all directions when we're talking about a sound wave, and usually has an S shape. When we're talking about sound waves, we can also note a couple of things, like the number of waves that pass a given point in a given time is its frequency. Wavelength depends on the distance between two consecutive top points or crests of the waves. Amplitude is the height of the crest, and pitch is perception of different frequencies, so that's based again on the number of waves that pass a given point in a given time. Now the normal range for pitch that humans can pick up is 20 to 20,000 hertz. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. Now loudness is amplitude, so that's what we perceive as loudness. So that is how high the crests are from trough to crest. And that's subject to interpretation depending on the person when it comes to sound intensity, but there is a normal range for the decibels. 0 to 120 is normally what people can hear when it comes to loudness and not damage their ears. Alright, here is transmission of sound to the inner ear, and this is going to be kind of our overview before we go back to how sound is processed from external or outer to middle to inner ear. Alright, so first, sound waves are moving through the outer ear, and they hit the eardrum. When they hit the eardrum, they're going to cause vibration of the auditory ossicles, and that's going to amplify the sound waves, because that's in preparation of the sound wave moving not through air like it does in the outer and middle ear, but through fluid in the cochlear canals. So the hammer, anvil, and stirrup vibrate enough to amplify the sound waves, and as they hit the oval window, it's those amplified sound waves that enter the cochlear canals. Now again, once we have that sound wave entering the cochlear canals, we're hoping it's strong enough to bump the basilar membrane and push the stereocilia on the hair cells into the tectorial membrane, and that will create our receptor potential that hopefully gives us a graded potential later in that cochlear nerve, because that can turn into an action potential in the cochlear nerve that heads towards the brain. So that's what we're seeing in this image. First, sound waves vibrate the tympanum, then the auditory ossicles vibrate, amplifying those sound waves. Then those pressure waves push in at the oval window, moving through fluid at the scala vestibuli. And sounds with frequencies below hearing would just travel all the way through the cochlea. They would go around the helicotrema, the end of the cochlea, and kind of die out. They would not excite any hair cells. Then sounds in the hearing range would go through the cochlear duct, vibrating the basilar membrane, bending the stereocilia or deflecting those hairs on inner hair cells. And that would lead to, again, our receptor potential, which is the graded potential in special sense organs that we need to get a graded potential in afferent neurons. If we get a graded potential in afferent neurons, we might get an action potential in the neuron that goes to the central nervous system. So auditory processing goes from the cochlear duct up the brainstem to the thalamus. That's again our relay station, or kind of area in the brain that everything enters that is sensory, and then out towards the primary auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe. Then from the primary auditory cortex, it will then move to an association cortex to be processed, and auditory processing involves impulses from specific hair cells being interpreted as specific pitches, and then loudness is detected by increased numbers of action potentials, so it's a frequency response. So for example, if you have an increased frequency of action potentials from certain hair cells, they would have experienced larger deflections, resulting in that increased frequency of action potentials. And then localization of sound depends on the relative intensity and timing of the sound waves reaching both ears, and then how quickly that is communicated to areas of the temporal lobe that process the raw data and then associate it. And then one of the other things we're going to look at just to finish up is homeostatic imbalances of hearing. There's conduction deafness and sensorineural deafness. With conduction deafness, nothing's wrong with the neural structures, or nothing has to be wrong with the neural structures of your ear, but something's blocking sound conduction. So the sound waves are not getting to the fluids of the internal ear. This could be impacted earwax, a perforated eardrum, it could be an infected middle ear, which is otitis media, or otosclerosis of the ossicles, where those ossicles don't move like they should. There's also sensorineural deafness, where we might be able to get sound waves to the internal ear, but there's some type of damage to neural structures at any point from the cochlear hair cells to the auditory cortical cells. Usually it's going to be gradual stereocilia or hair cell loss that causes sensorineural deafness, so it's usually a progressive type of deafness. And then one of the things we're going to finish up with is looking at nerve structure. So a nerve is a bundle of neuron fibers, a bundle of axons. So what we call a peripheral nerve is not just one neuron. So this is a very cord-like organ. It's of the peripheral nervous system, and it's similar in structure to skeletal muscle fibers. It's bundles upon bundles with 3 connective tissue layers. What covers multiple axons would be a middle layer called the perineurium, and we'd call those multiple bundled axons a fascicle. Now, each one of those axons covered in myelin sheath would be surrounded by an endoneurium, and an overcoat of all of this would be the epineurium. So you have the epineurium overcoat surrounding fascicles covered in perineurium, surrounding cells covered in endoneurium. That's the structure for a nerve. Now, mixed nerves would carry sensory and motor information. Sensory nerves carry just sensory information, and motor nerves carry just motor information. Here is that information laid out again for the structure of a nerve. Endoneurium is the loose connective tissue that encloses axons and their myelin sheaths. Perineurium is the coarse connective tissue that bundles fibers into fascicles, and epineurium is the tough fibrous sheath around a nerve. Alright, next we're going to be looking at the classification of nerves, and that's going to be the last part of this series about Chapter 13, so make sure to watch that video.